Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are. Hosted by Desiree Duffy.
Welcome, everybody. It is time for the Books That Make You show. I'm your host, Desiree Duffy, and we are talking about books that make you say, no way, they were gay? Throughout history, gay people have done amazing things. They've led nations, made inventions, contributed to science and art, culture, sports, literature, and so much more. But very often, the nature of their gender was hidden, obscured, not included in our history books, not discussed openly. Because for way too long, people were often told to, keep it in the closet. History has been crafted by the people who recorded it. And sometimes those historians were biased against, or maybe they just didn't even see or couldn't imagine anyone different than themselves. Our guest today is the author of No Way, They Were Gay, Hidden Lives and Secret Loves. He takes readers on a fascinating journey through primary sources, poetry, memoirs, news clippings, and images of ancient artwork to explore the hidden queer lives and loves of 24 different historical figures. Lee Wind is also the author of the crowd-funded YA novel, Queer as a $5 Bill, featured as a Publishers Weekly indie success story. His upcoming picture book is called Red and Green and Blue and White, and it will be published in October of 2021. His day job, this is a busy guy, is for the Independent Book Publishers Association, where he is their marketing and programming director, and at the Society of Children's Books, Writers and Illustrators, where he's their official blogger. Lee Wind, hello, welcome to the show.
Hi, Desiree. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks.
Oh, this is going to be a great interview. You yourself have such an amazing resume. You do so much, and you do so much that has a giving spirit to it. And I thank you and I applaud you for that. So kind of segueing into the big question, this book, tell us about it. Give us that big 30,000 foot overview. Why did you write No Way, They Were Gay?
So I wrote it because I kept saying it. I'm gay myself, but I was closeted from age 11 to 25. And I didn't even come out to myself fully until I was about 21. And it was just such a hard journey for me. I really grew up, there wasn't the internet, and I really grew up thinking that I was the only guy who liked other guys in the history of the world. And it was extremely isolating and difficult. And as I grew up and kind of started to hear about, I wasn't the only one. I mean, even within the queer community, there's this idea that our history began in 1969 at the Stonewall riots. And I was, because I didn't come out until my 20s, I ended up spending some time in my 20s kind of reliving the things I would have done as a teenager. So one of those included going to a weekend for gay men in the woods at a camp, and they had all these different activities, trying to sort of heal your inner teen, I guess, in some ways. And one of the things was a lecture, and this guy was talking about these letters that Abraham Lincoln had written Joshua Fry Speed, and they were letters that convinced him that Abraham was in love with Joshua. And I just sort of sat there kind of like, what? You were making that up. That cannot possibly be true. How could I have, already been an out gay man for about 10 years and never even heard of this? But I couldn't get it out of my mind. So I went to the library. That's where I do most of my research. And I got out a book. And it was interesting because I love the premise of this show, like books that make you, right? Like it was a book that they'd only ever printed 250 copies of. And it was written by a historian, and it was about the friendship between Joshua Fry Speed and Abraham Lincoln. And in the back, there was a sort of appendix that had the actual letters, all of them reprinted, all the ones that have survived. And when I was a teen, when I was a young person, I dated girls. I was completely in the closet, and I was trying to convince myself that this would work. And I knew I didn't feel what I was supposed to feel, but I kept hoping the feeling would come. And Abraham and Joshua, we know historically, they lived together for 4 years. And then After that time, Joshua moved back to Kentucky and married a woman named Fanny. And among the letters we have that have survived, Abraham writes him a letter 8 months after Joshua's been married and says, "Are you now in feeling as well as judgment glad that you're married as you are? From anybody but me, this would be an impudent question not to be tolerated, but I know you'll tolerate it from me. Please tell me quickly. I feel very impatient to know." We don't have the answer, but we do know it was only 4 weeks later that Abraham married Mary Todd. So I read that letter and I got goosebumps. I was like, oh my gosh, that is exactly how I felt. I judged it, but I didn't feel it. And I started to be like, well, maybe this is real. Maybe Abraham and Joshua did have this relationship. And I started to dig into it. And the more I researched, the more I became convinced that, oh my gosh, yes, I think Abraham was in love with Joshua. And it was the beginning of 2 books. One ended up being a novel that I crowdfunded called Queer as a $5 Bill, about a teenager that has that same goosebump moment I did, that he's dating his best friend sort of inadvertently, this girl, and he judges it but doesn't feel it. And then he is assigned a book report on Abraham Lincoln, discovers it, becomes convinced Abraham's was in love with Joshua, and decides since everybody loves Abraham Lincoln in the US, he's going to out Lincoln and change how the world perceives gay people. And of course, that's a really altruistic, wonderful goal. But I imagine that if it actually happened, it would just trigger a huge media firestorm and conservative backlash, which is what happens in the novel. And then while I was writing the novel, I wanted to write a page turner, and I just kept coming up with more and more evidence. And at some point, I just was like, I can't shove all this into the novel. Maybe there's a nonfiction book here. But I don't know about you, but like when I was learning history in school, it was really taught like medicine. It was names and dates to memorize, and I never really liked it very much. So I thought like a book, even for me, like a book about Abraham and Joshua being in love didn't even sound super, like a nonfiction book, didn't even sound like something I was interested in. But the thing about Abraham Lincoln was that it was like the crack in the facade, the first crack in the facade for me. Like we're taught that history is the story of rich, white, straight, able-bodied, cisgendered men from Europe. And, it leaves out all these other stories, the stories of women, the stories of people of color, the stories of disabled people, the stories of men who loved men and women who loved women, and people who loved without regard to gender, and also people who lived outside gender boundaries. And I just kept thinking, maybe that is an idea for a book, maybe taking down that whole facade and talking about all those categories, the men who loved men, the women who loved women, the people who loved without regard to gender, and the people who lived outside gender boundaries. Maybe that's the book I can write, and it will help open up history for everyone else too. So that's where No Way They Were Gay came from.
I love all of that. And there's so many directions we can go next. So let's start with the research that you did, because you're not just taking some anecdotal evidence. In many cases, you're going straight to the source, or you're using primary sources. I want to talk about, and you mentioned going to the library. You're not even just Googling. You're not getting this off of Wikipedia. Talk about your research, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's very exciting to know that you can open up a book and someone will say something and you can go to the endnotes and you can find out, well, where did they get that? And then you can find that book and you can get it from the library, and then you can look and see the page number of that book and you can find out, well, where did they get that? And you can eventually backtrack until you're finding actual primary sources. And one of the really cool things that my publisher did, Learner, for this book, is that they agreed with my idea to bold all the primary sources, because the book is really written for anybody age 11 and up. So the idea that at a glance you can go through the book and you can find what was an actual thing that somebody said historically, I think is really exciting, because I feel like a lot of history is presented through this veil, right? Through this filter. And I don't want to be a filter. I want to be like, here are the voices from the past. I'll explain to you how I interpret it. I'll acknowledge that most historians don't agree with me, and really leave it up to the reader to make their own decision. But the primary sources are right there. There's also a really significant endnote section so people can go back and track. So like that book I told you that had the Abraham Lincoln letters, it's not the only book those letters are published in. They were published in many, many other compendiums of Lincoln's writings. And sometimes just portions, sometimes half of a letter, sometimes just a few lines. But I was really conscientious to really show it, because I'm not I'm not a discoverer, finding lost volumes under the floorboards of something. Like I'm going to the internet and I'm finding, Wikipedia, some people say that it is actually more accurate than the Encyclopedia Britannica. But the great thing about Wikipedia is that you can go to the links and you can find out where are they saying this is from, and then you can backtrack the same way. It is being a little bit of a researcher and going back and finding stuff and trying to make sure that the quotes you're getting are accurate, that they've been translated authentically. I mean, one of the big problems is that history's really been sanitized. And so like when Michelangelo wrote a love poem to another man, 60 years after he died, his family changed the pronouns to make it look like he had actually written it to a woman. And then it took hundreds of years for us to get it restored. Same thing happened with William Shakespeare. He wrote 126 love sonnets to another man. And at one time they were published as all the pronouns were changed, and it was published as, love sonnets to his mistress. It's really, and then it took a long, long time to get it restored, to get it back.
Right.
We can all do it. That's what's so exciting. It's available to all of us.
Yeah. All this information is hidden in plain sight, so to speak. And, I can't help but address the 800-pound elephant that's looming over us right now, because on other fronts, we have, people that are detracting and trying to keep things like critical race theory from being taught in schools, and people who are saying, hey, we need to kind of keep history the way it was taught. And the reality is because it's been revised by others in the past who might have, again, going back to that opening monologue, maybe they did it intentionally. Maybe it was the family who didn't want people to know that William Shakespeare was gay. Maybe it was historians along the way who wanted to make sure that Abraham Lincoln was seen as one of the, the 16th president of the United States. And again, it goes back to the book. No way they were gay. So I think what you're doing is very brave and bold as well. Do you feel that? Especially, I don't know, like you and your publisher could not have timed this book to come out at this point in history when these kinds of questions are being raised. How does that make you feel?
Well, I'm very grateful to my publisher, because they're actually not the first publisher of this book. This book was purchased, oh my gosh, like 7 years ago, originally by one of the big 5 publishers. At the time there were 5, and it was all great and going really well. And then our previous president, Trump, was elected, and 2 weeks after his election, my book was canceled. They just freaked out. And then it took a year for us to find another publisher that was willing to do it. And I didn't start from scratch, but a lot of the book was redone. And actually the book, I think, is better now. I'm really excited that it's finally out, but it was like this thrumming need for me to get this out, because I felt like every minute the book is not available is a minute I'm losing the opportunity to sort of shine this light on it, because it is kind of like the world seen with a different lens. It's not a new world. It's just getting to see it in a new way. Like one of the opening images of the book is a map of the world upside down. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. For those watching the YouTube video, I'll hold up the image. But it's we are so accustomed in the Northern Hemisphere to seeing the map the other way. And if you live in the Southern Hemisphere, it probably feels a little bit like, oh, you're not as important. But if you flip the map upside down, and which you can all do, right? Go do it at home, play along at home. It does make you see our world in a slightly different way. Like, wow, that's what the continents look like from the other side. And there really is no like correct up on the world. The world is a sphere hurtling through space. Let's be honest, right? So having a different lens can really change how we think about things. And I think that goes back to, being bibliophiles and being word people. Words are so important. I think like the word homosexual is not particularly helpful, because it makes everyone think that what is the important thing in my life as opposed to their life is, because I'm a gay person, is sex. And that the thing that holds me and my husband and our teenage daughter together as a family, it's love. Like, that's the glue that holds my family together, just like it holds everybody's family together. And I think if we had changed the word, if it was homo-lovual, we would be having very different cultural conversations. We wouldn't be talking about, we shouldn't teach about, we shouldn't teach about sex in schools. Nobody is saying that we should teach kindergartners about sex. Mm-hmm. But when we talk about, look at the laws the law in Russia, the law they keep trying to pass in Tennessee, the law they just passed in Hungary. There are these ideas that exposing young people to any information about their existing queer people is dangerous for them. And it's because of this misunderstanding, this sort of like bad mental model that they're using, that talking about queer people is talking about sex. And it's not. It's talking about love, and it's talking about identity. And those are things that you really should be able to talk to the youngest child about, because those are the parts, those are the foundational things about who we are as human beings.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we think it's almost cliche to ask the little girl, do you want to be a princess when you grow up? And to say to the little boy, are you going to be big and strong like your dad? And you're infusing at a very young age those gender identities. And all it really is about is, like you said, love, as well as the idea that when the child is at the age where they can explore and decide for themselves, they can do that without feeling that they're doing something wrong. And that leads me to you too, if you don't mind me asking about yourself, because you said that you stayed in the closet until your early 20s. If you could go back in time and meet teenage Lee, 20-year-old Lee, what would you say to him?
I hand him my book. I feel like truly learning any one of these 24 stories. I mean, there are 12 chapters that go in real depth, and then there's 12 more that are just sort of like a paragraph or two. But like, knowing any of it would have made me realize that it wasn't true. Like, the facade was not true, and any break in that facade would have made me feel like maybe there was room for me in the world. And I feel like if I had some reflection of there being the possibility of me existing authentically, maybe it would have happened earlier for me. I didn't feel safe. My family, my parents are immigrants, and when they came from Israel, they sort of brought the homophobia of their parents and that culture with them. And I just know that, safety is a huge thing in someone being able to come out. But in being able to come out to yourself, I look back and I think about the fact that it took me 10 years to be honest with myself. And so much of that was because I just had no reflection in the world around me. And I think that kids today they have the internet, hopefully, and they know they're not the only person. They're not the only guy that likes other guys in the history of the world. But to know that it's not a brand new thing, like in our parents' time, our grandparents' time, everybody thinks that this stuff is new. And even in terms of the fear that people have, the transphobia that's happening now, where in 2021, there have been more anti-trans laws put forward in state legislators, I believe, than perhaps ever before. And it's based on this sort of like, it's a very calculated fear-mongering sort of appeal to conservative people who are scared of difference. And they're scared of it because we've kind of presented it as, people who are living outside these two gender boxes is a completely new thing, and they're destroying the culture. Well, hold on, it's not a completely new thing. If you go back over 2,000 years, there was a pharaoh named Hatshepsut in Egypt who literally over 22 years of ruling Egypt completely changed their gender presentation. So they were the wife and the daughter of the pharaoh, right? Mm-hmm. And they were the daughter of the pharaoh, and then they married their half brother, which was really common back then because they wanted to, keep the bloodline pure. No one had any idea that was a bad idea. And but of course, they also had this problem that they needed a male heir. Very patriarchal society, and so when her brother/husband died, Hatshepsut convinced, she was 16 years old, and she convinced the ruling elite to let her continue to rule Egypt as a woman, as regent for her 2-year-old nephew, because he was actually the next person that was technically in line for the throne, but a 2-year-old couldn't rule one of the great empires of the ancient world. So 16 years old, she does this. And then 5 years in, she proclaims herself king, not queen, king, a co-king with her nephew. And you can see when you look at the photos of the statues, like her presentation changes, and she's suddenly dressed in men's clothes, and her jaw's a little squared off, and she doesn't have breasts anymore. It's sort of an in between breasts and pecs, but no shirt. Like, it's really, really interesting. And then there's this sort of like towards the end of her reign, she's presented completely as a man, squared off shoulders, abs, like a false beard, and we can see this progression. There's even a temple, one of her temples, that the statues were painted in different colors because it was very traditional in ancient Egyptian art. Men were painted red, women, because they were out in the wide world, and I guess they got tan, and women were painted yellow because elite women stayed inside. And then for Hatshepsut statues, they literally progress from yellow to orange, which was a completely non-traditional color, to red. So it's this amazing progression. And I think that for gender fluid kids today, for gender queer kids today, to know that, like, hey, go back in time, there was this pharaoh who was totally gender queer. Like, wow, that would be so empowering and exciting. And for the rest of us, it's really important for us to know it too, because we need to like see the world differently, flip the map upside down, and recognize that like this isn't new, that these people have a legacy, and we should listen and honor it because it honors them.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and it's so fascinating too how different cultures, different periods in time attribute different colors to genders.
Yeah,
the
pinky.
orange and we have pink and blue, right? Pink. If you see blue and pink, it's boy, girl. For them in ancient Egypt, it was red and yellow.
And that's changed over time too, because pink used to be the color for boys as recently as like the 1800s. And there's actually a really cool quote from some like department store catalog, and it's like, pink being a stronger color is decidedly for the boy. And it's just so interesting
right.
how that's changed just in the last couple hundred years. And so it is completely a cultural construct, gender. And yet we've built buildings that have sort of institutionalized this idea that you're going to be in one of two boxes, and it really disenfranchises so many people. There was a study recently of high schoolers, and they found that I believe it was 9%. So 9 out of 100. No, excuse me, it was 11. 11 out of 100 kids identified outside the gender boundary, the gender binary. And I thought that was remarkable, right? Like that's really, really amazing. And but even if it was one kid out of 100, like we still should be doing this work. We still should be being allies and trying to make our world a safer place for them, because nobody should waste 14 years in the closet.
Absolutely. So you've mentioned some really great figures in your book. Is there any figure or story or history, something that as you were reading and doing your research all of them are amazing, but where you were just like mind blown, you had no idea. Can you give us one of those, please?
Absolutely. So, and actually, the reason the book is titled "No Way They Were Gay" is because I kept saying it. The unifying theme of the book is me being surprised. Like I was like, "What? No way they were gay." So Sappho is actually the one I want to share, because I had heard of Sappho. I mean, there's a word sapphic, which sort of means lesbian-ish. Sappho came from the island of Lesbos. That's where we get the word lesbian. Sappho was really known for being a woman who loved other women. And what we don't know is that Sappho is the reason behind the kiss of true love, breaking the evil spell, and all those sort of fairy tales and books. So here's the scoop. Sappho was like a rock star poet of her time. And she was, she was a lyric poet, which didn't mean that she wrote poems down and they were published somewhere. This was like 2,600 years ago. So she sang her poems, or she accompanied herself. She maybe spoke them. Like it was like, Deaf Poetry Jam or something of the time, and accompanying herself on an instrument. And one of the poems that she performed was about love. And it was about all the other poets at the time. Mostly the famous ones were men. And almost all of them said that the most beautiful thing in the world, the most important thing in the world, was a sort of expression of male aggression. It was an army or warships or, infantry at full display at arms. Like it was that sort of masculine thing. That was the most beautiful thing. That was what they praised. And Sappho wrote this poem, and she was like, no, the most beautiful thing of all is the face of the woman I love shining radiant. Like that's, and the name of the woman was Anactoria. And that poem that survived sort of captured the hearts and minds of people at the time, and it really caught on. And if you trace it through, this idea that love is the most powerful thing of all is what ended up being 800 years ago incorporated into the story of Sleeping Beauty and what wakes her up from the evil spell. It is how all the Disney movies end. And what we've done is we've stripped out why Sappho said it. And we've inherited this culture that, yes, we all, I think almost everybody listening to this would agree, yes, we believe love is the most powerful force in the whole universe. And, Sappho was the one who said it first. And she said it because she loved this other woman that she was missing so much at the time. And that completely blew my mind. I was like, what? So shout out to Sappho. It's just incredible. I loved learning that.
Yeah. You touch on something that, seriously, we need to have you come back on the show, because I've always been struck by this idea that in order to have power, in order to be alpha, in order to be top, you have to be masculine. It's all about fighting the wars, being strong, being brave. And even when you use Hatshepsut as an example, she conformed to looking masculine and manlike. What would a world be like where it was just okay for the feminine to be the powerful thing, and the women didn't need to necessarily usurp looking and feeling and behaving like a man in order to be powerful?
Yes, a matriarchy. Bring it on.
a matriarchy, but done in the way so that the matriarchy is okay to be feminine too. So that's something that's always interested.
It is interesting if you look at, sometimes women in power are really take pains to not feel like they have a choice, right? Like they can either be feminine or they can be women of power. And we sort of ask our daughters and our sisters and the women in our lives to buy into that. And it's very, very challenging, right? Because we want women to recognize that they can be powerful and beautiful. And you had your interview with the author about Strong Like Water, right? This idea that you don't have to give up your vulnerability to be strong. My teenage daughter, she's not the loudest person in the room, but when she does speak, it's really profound, and people stop and they listen to her, and she influences things in that way. So she's exerting a kind of power that's very different than the sort of masculine expression of power, but it is just as powerful, and in some ways more powerful, because being the loudest person in the room, you end up in a shouting match. But if you're, there are other ways of being an influencer.
Absolutely. So, okay, this book, do you feel it's a resource for parents, teachers, librarians, educators? I know everybody should read this book, but who should really be reading this book?
Well, I think that anybody that wants to have a different sense of history, that's open to seeing that world upside down. Because, once you look at the map of the world upside down, you're never even going to look at a map of the world right side up, sort of as we imagine it, the same way again, because the map can be flipped, right? So once you recognize that history has been sort of sanitized for the protection of the people in power, it opens you up to so many other stories. It doesn't have to be my book, but my gosh, there are so many amazing stories out there. The stories of women, the stories of people of color, the stories of disabled people. Like, go into the history and look at the primary source materials, because it sort of pushes aside all those historians. I'm not saying that historians are bad, but I am saying that they are biased. And I'll acknowledge, I'll own up to it. I am biased too, but I try to put my bias out there and be really upfront about it. So like in the Sappho chapter, when I was doing the research, I came upon a poem where Sappho was sort of pining with love for a young man. And I was like, oh man, what do I do with this? And then I was like, well, I include it, of course, because I don't want to be that person cherry picking from history. So I included it. And I also included this historian, Dr. Christine Downing, had said when she presented it in her book for adults that, while we do have this poem, the bulk of the surviving poems of Sappho really show that her emotional life was directed towards other women. So we can acknowledge that history is complex, and people can be complex without being afraid that we're doing a disservice. We're actually doing a service to young people, because if we let them know that historically people were complex, they'll know that, oh yeah, I can be complex too. And if we let them know that these people existed, that queer people existed in history, then whether they are queer or not, they will have more respect for people today. And for those that are queer, if they know that they have a past, they'll know they deserve a place at the table today. And if they know they have a place at the table today, they can imagine a future without limits.
Coming up next for Lee, can you tell us about your forthcoming book?
Yeah, it's called Red and Green and Blue and White. It's a picture book. The illustrator is the amazing Paul Zielinski, who has won the Caldecott Medal and kind of got the Caldecott honor, I think, 2 or 3 times. He's amazing. He does a different style of art for every book. It's coming out from Levine Querido, a new publishing house from a publisher actually that used to publish the Harry Potter series in America. So this man knows good stuff. And Arthur Levine, and I'm super excited. It's a story that's also about empowering young people, but it's really a story for young kids. And it's based on a true story about, the reason it's called Red and Green and Blue and White is red and green are the Christmas colors and blue and white are the Hanukkah colors. And it is about something that happens in a small town in Montana in the 1990s, where a house decorated for Hanukkah, a stone is thrown through their window because most of the houses are decorated for Christmas. And it's all about how the community rises up to say, no, not in our town. We believe in a culture, in a community, in a society that celebrates differences, and we're going to stand up together. And it's the story of the 2 young children at the heart of a community standing up for love.
I love it. I love it. Okay, Lee, really quick, where can people find out more about you? Plug your blog, please, as well as tell people where they can go to find your books.
Sure. So leewind.org, I guess how we phrase things, right? It's a .org because I really do feel like so much of what I do is to try to make the world a better place. So leewind.org. And then the books are available everywhere books are sold. So you can get it online. You can get it from your local indie bookstore. I love when you do that because that's really good. That helps make our world a better place too. And yes, I have a blog. I blog 3 days a week. And I basically want to cover books for kids and teens that include LGBTQ characters and themes, and also talking about cultural things and history, and really trying to make it a site of interest. I've been doing it for a long time now, for over 12 years. So it's gotten a lot of librarians and teachers that are there, but I'm really writing for that, 11-year-old and up young queer person that, that's why it's called I'm Here, I'm Queer, What the Hell Do I Read?
Yeah. I love it. I love it. Lee, go ahead, hold up your book so we can see the beautiful cover close up for all the YouTube people. And for everybody else, thank you so much for listening to the Books That Make You show today. And you can find out more about us on our website. It's booksthatmakeyou.com. And as well, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Sign up for our newsletter and make sure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can ring the bell, not to mention the fact that we are heard Sunday nights on mystar95.com. Thank you one and all for being with us here today. Until next time, please enjoy all of the books that make you exactly who you are.
The executive producer for Books That Make You is Desiree Duffy. Produced and sound mastered by Phil Giangrande. Engineering by Dave Nabox. Social media and promotion by Bree Sweeter. For more, visit booksthatmakeyou.com.